What's going on, guys? It's Pete Nova from the Face Off Sports Network. I am back with my week 4 wide receiver must start and must sits. The first player that I am ensuring I have in every single fantasy lineup this week is going to be none other than Chris Godwin, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. This is an Eagles secondary that is giving up the sixth most points to the wide receiver position in fantasy football. It's a young secondary under Vic Fangio. They're learning an entirely new system. They have two highly drafted cornerbacks that they took this year in the NFL draft that are still trying to find their way in this defense. And I think they're going to be better in the second half of the year, but nothing has really given me the inclination that they have figured it out just yet. Last week, Chris Olave was able to have 20 plus fantasy points. Now, Raheed Shaheed, who was one of my guys to start last week, did put up a donut on the week, but he dropped a long touchdown that would have definitely, he would have had a pretty solid week if you started him in fantasy. But I do think this defense is susceptible to giving up points to the position. That's why they're sixth in the NFL. And I think Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are going to have a really strong game, in terms of fantasy points. And Chris Godwin right now is fourth in points per game in the NFL, and that might surprise people. Chris Godwin, not like the flashiest, sexiest name, but this offense has put him in the slot, which is where he's most comfortable and has been his entire career. He had a little bit of a down year in 2023, but they did play him the lowest amount of snaps he's ever played in the slot. They've got him back at his true position there, and he's flourishing. He's fifth in target share in the entire NFL, and that's next to Mike Evans, who is a Hall of Famer in his own right. And he's still playing really good football, Mike Evans. And so it's pretty remarkable to see what Baker has been able to do with these wide receivers. They did get punched in the mouth a little bit against the Denver Broncos last week, but Broncos got to the quarterback seven times, and Godwin was still able to find the end zone and have a successful day for fantasy. He had 14 plus points. So I am making sure that I have Chris Godwin in all lineups. You probably don't have somebody better to start than this guy. And if you think you do, you're probably overthinking it. So make sure you have Chris Godwin in your lineups this week. My second must start on the week is going to be none other than Jauan Jennings of the 49ers taking on the New England Patriots. Now, unless you were living under a rock, that Jauan Jennings had a monster week last week, 11 catches for 176 yards and 3 touchdowns, a pretty crazy stat. Jennings was targeted on 12 of his 27 routes that he ran, which is a 44.4% target share, which is absolutely ludicrous. He's going up against a Patriots defense that, is seventh in fantasy points allowed to the position. Christian Gonzalez is a wonderful corner. He's very good, and I project him to be tough for wide receivers, but Brandon Ayuk is going to draw that matchup. And we saw the Seattle Seahawks number 2 receiver in JSN be successful against this defense while DK Metcalf was covered by Gonzalez for most of the game. Now, Metcalf did have a long touchdown, but it wasn't on Christian Gonzalez. And so I expect Gonzalez to shadow Ayuk this game. Now, the elephant in the room is if Deebo Samuel plays, I probably am not going to start Jauan Jennings unless they say he's on a pitch count. But if George Kittle plays, I am still happy to start Jennings in the flex in 12-team formats or higher. But get Jauan Jennings in your lineups if you're in a 12-man or higher league format, as well as if Deebo Samuel is out. If Kittle's in, he's definitely going to eat into some production. I mean, it's George Kittle, but Jauan Jennings looked phenomenal in that game last week, and I expect him to string another good week along here if Deebo Samuel does not play. My third must start on the week is going to be Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who's taking on the Detroit Lions. Now, this Detroit Lions defense is second worst in terms of points allowed to the wide receiver position. JSN, he broke out week 2 against the Patriots defense, which we just talked about. I mean, he had 16 targets. Now, I don't know if JSN's in line for 16 targets, but he did have the best game of his entire career last week. I'm sorry, in week 2. And, week 3, the game script kind of hindered him. They played against the Miami Dolphins. And if you listen to the podcast, we were encouraging people to sit Waddle and Tyreek Hill because I just felt like it was going to lend itself to running the football a lot because this Dolphins offense is kind of in disarray right now with Tua Tagovailoa not playing. So that kind of hindered JSN's production last week, but he's got a really good matchup against the Detroit Lions. This Detroit Lions defense, their run defense is really good. I mean, it's been the best in the NFL for points surrendered to the running back position in fantasy football, but obviously what they're not giving up on the ground, they're giving up in the pass game. Like I said, second worst in terms of points allowed to the wide receiver position. They're just getting gashed there. And these Detroit and Seattle games, for what it's worth, like they've been very high scoring over the last few years, and they always tend to be fun games to watch. So I expect that to be a high scoring game and to continue that trend. And so I'm making sure I start JSN in fantasy formats. He's a must play this week for me. Now, my first sit of the week is going to be Michael Pittman. This Steelers defense has been very stingy to the wide receiver position, 4th best versus wide receivers in terms of points allowed. Michael Pittman, I mean, if you watch the podcast, he was actually my biggest bust when we did our flag plants a week before the season started. Michael Pittman was the guy that I said was going to bust this year based on his ADP. I mean, right now, 8 fantasy points on the season in standard leagues, and in PPR it's a little bit higher, but I mean, he just really hasn't gotten it done, folks. And now you have Josh Downs coming back, and Josh Downs, I mean, out-targeted Michael Pittman in his first game back. You have Alec Pierce, who over the span of time that Josh Downs was out, Alec Pierce was the best wide receiver for this Colts offense. Now, don't get me wrong, it is not all on Michael Pittman. Anthony Richardson has not been great, and he's going to take some time to grow. And unfortunately, those growing pains are going to affect Michael Pittman, who's going up against a really stingy defense this week in the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I'm definitely sitting Michael Pittman this week. And a crazy stat, or just an interesting one, Josh Downs in his first game, like I said, was out targeting Michael Pittman, but Josh Downs had a team high first read target rate. 33% of the first read targets went to Josh Downs, and that's provided by Fantasy Points Data Suite. Really good place to check out stats and kind of get ahead of the game if you're looking for something like that. Fantasy Points has a lot of good information. But getting into my second sit, it's going to be Jaylen Waddle. I talked about this Dolphins offense before, and yeah, I mean, it's just not great, guys. We don't know. Is it going to be Skylar Thompson? Is it going to be Tim Boyle? Is it going to be Huntley? Like, we have no idea, but I just don't like it for Jaylen Waddle. I mean, the Titans are 3rd best versus wide receivers in fantasy. L'Jarius Sneed, he may be matched up on Tyreek Hill. It might be Waddle, but the rest of that secondary is very good. They were able to limit DJ Moore in week 1, Garrett Wilson in week 2 against the Jets. So I don't really think Waddle is a guy that I want to start. I'm doing everything possible that I can to sit him. Got to have better plays. I would start all 3 of the guys that I mentioned today over Jaylen Waddle this week. In terms of like his performance last week, I mean, 3 fantasy points in standard, 4 points in standard week 2, PPR a little bit higher, but you're really just hoping for one big play with Jaylen Waddle, which is kind of the same thing with Hill against this offense. And this game is the lowest projected points on the week. It's 37 per Vegas for the implied point total. So I do not want to start Jaylen Waddle. I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure he's not in any of my lineups. Even if I have to stream some players this week, I just don't want anything to do with Waddle. Obviously, if you don't have somebody better, then get him in your lineup. You know, a lot of injuries out there, so I totally understand that. But I'm sitting Jaylen Waddle this week, guys. I really want nothing to do with him. And then another player in this game, but on the other side of the football, or I'm sorry, the other sideline, is Calvin Ridley. I really liked Calvin Ridley coming into the year. He's at the, in the top 10, I believe, in the league for air yards. So Levis is throwing him the football downfield, and he's been okay for fantasy. The first 2 weeks he was good. Last week we saw what happened. Just an absolute disaster against that Packers defense. But Calvin Ridley, Miami's defense, it's 10th best against opposing wide receivers for fantasy football. And that's also slightly inflated due to last week. I mean, the Dolphins played against the Seattle Seahawks, who didn't really have to throw the football a ton. I mean, DK Metcalf was good for fantasy. Don't get me wrong. Had an amazing play last week. But outside of that, I mean, like, Tyler Lockett and JSN didn't do much, and the game script didn't make, they didn't have to. And the fact that Miami's pass defense is 10th best against opposing wide receivers. So I just don't really love this spot for Calvin Ridley. The weather, they're saying it's going to rain. It's not looking great. And again, this is a low point total this week, like I talked about with Waddle. So I don't really want Waddle or Ridley. Guys like A-Chain and Pollard, you probably have to start guys like that. I don't mind A-Chain in this matchup. But I am sitting Calvin Ridley, and I feel pretty good about that. But that's going to do it for me here. If you guys do have questions or concerns and you want those answered, feel free to drop them into the comment section for this video. Also, drop us a like. It would be very appreciated. Subscribe, of course, if you're not already. What are you doing? Subscribe to the YouTube channel. But that's going to do it for me, guys. Thanks so much, and I will see you next time.